Our scripture this evening comes from 1 Samuel chapter 3. It reads, "Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim, so that he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called, 'Samuel, Samuel.' And he said, 'Here I am,' and ran to Eli and said, 'Here I am, for you called me.' But he said, 'I did not call. Lie down again.' So he went and lay down. The Lord called again, 'Samuel.' Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, 'Here I am, for you called me.' But he said, 'I did not call, my son. Lie down again.' Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again, a third time, and he got up and went to Eli and said, 'Here I am, for you called me.' Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, 'Go, lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, 'Samuel, Samuel.' And Samuel said, 'Speak, for your servant is listening.' Then the Lord said to Samuel, 'See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears of it tingle. On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. Therefore I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be expiated by sacrifice or offering forever.' Samuel lay there until morning. Then he opened the doors to the house of the Lord. Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. But Eli called Samuel and said, 'Samuel, my son.' He said, 'Here I am.' Eli said, 'What was it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you, and more also, if you hide anything from me of all that he told you.' So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. Then he said, 'It is the Lord. Let him do what he seems good to him.' As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was trustworthy prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord." Thanks be to God. If y'all want to go sit, you're more than welcome to. With this text, what I am reminded of is that Eli and Samuel needed each other to hear from God. Samuel had stopped hearing from God because he had stopped doing what he was supposed to when it came to his son's iniquities. And Eli, as it's noted, had yet to hear the word of the Lord and wasn't sure what it sounded like. And so because these two needed each other, they were actually able to hear God. And I'm reminded that for many of us, our call to the gospel requires one another. Sometimes we hear God on our own, but more often than not, we hear it amongst one another. For my own call, I am reminded that I am shaped greatly by those who helped draw out or name, as Samuel did for Eli, the word of God. For me, when I think about my own journey and call, while I hold the role as pastor, my call is to the church. I still believe the church has this ability to make an agent of change in our community, and that is my ultimate call. I may hold the role of pastor, but whether I retire or shift careers, my call will still be part of the gospel. And there are a lot of folks who help shape that along the way. This morning, we had two little ones have baby dedication, one of whom was named Aubrey, Rose, who's named after her grandfather. And as I looked out this morning, I was reminded that I too am named after my grandfather, Jeffrey Morgan. He was a pulpit supply pastor in rural Oklahoma. And I'm pretty sure that of all his grandchildren, that he didn't expect the youngest female to be a Baptist pastor. And yet, I follow in his footsteps. There was a bit of time before I realized what my call was next, and I was at Covenant Bible College in Strathmore, Alberta, Canada. And it was part of the Evangelical Free Church, or Evangelical Covenant Church. And I had my first female professor, and Kathy Brawley and I went toe-to-toe, because at that time, I was not in the same place around equity of women. I just assumed that I knew that there was equity and we didn't have to name it, and Kathy kept agitating and poking and prodding and drawing forth within me my call. On my last day of Bible college, she hugged me and she said, "Goodbye, Pastor." And I said, "That's funny, we don't have Baptist female pastors." Little did I know that there were Baptist traditions that did. And sure enough, her words haunted me a great deal. The next person to really kind of agitate and flesh out my call was my ethics professor in undergrad, Paul Martins. He taught his class this way. Any aspect of ethic that we were discussing in his class, we had to choose one of the polarized views. We could never choose the middle way. And the reasoning for it is, he says, if you can argue one of the extremes, you better understand your place in the middle. And for me, I took this to great heart. And so my classmates loved being in class with me because it was a full-bodied discussion as I was trying to discern where I would vote. So each class ended with a vote. Did you agree with it? Did you not agree with it? Whatever the topic of ethic was that day. And so I'd be sitting there looking at the whiteboard, looking at the history of this particular ethic discussion, and I'd say, okay, I agree with that part, but not that part, but if I want to get to the end, I have to agree. And it would be this full, agitated, trying to figure out wrestling. And then I realized at the end of it, he actually allowed me to realize how I was living my life and my theological beliefs, as well as my social beliefs, were trying to wrestle with each other. And that's what I was feeling internally. He helped me see my call. After that, I went to grad school. And in grad school, I was serving at in-home case management with in Corsicana, Texas, at the Presbyterian Children's Home and Services. And my supervisor at the time said, really, the church has lost its place in the community. And the only place for it is to open its space for nonprofits like ours. And I remember getting mad, but I didn't know why I was mad. I had to figure it out. And so for my next internship, I knew that I needed to serve under a female pastor because I'd never served under a female pastor. And I was trying to understand my own journey, potentially, to the church. And I needed to figure out why I was upset that somebody didn't think the church still had a purpose in the community. So I interned at a wonderful church by Calvary Baptist Church of Washington, D.C. And while I was there, I served under the amazing tutelage of Reverend Dr. Amy Butler and Reverend Dr. Leah Grunset Davis and Reverend Dr. Edgar Palacios. And it was because of them and the community that I was able to realize that there was this whole world of Baptist life I had no idea about. I grew up Southern Baptist, and it was all consuming. I didn't realize that there were other strands of Baptist that would allow me to be who I felt I could be in the church. And it also taught me that I felt called to be a pastor. And it was because of them that I was able to step into that pastoral identity. And then it was that same boss of mine, Amy Butler, who told me about a job here at Calvary Baptist Church of Denver. And I said, oh, that's really nice. I already lived in Denver. I grew up there. I don't want to go back. And she said, the church is healthy. That's not always common. Go and apply. And through that process, it was a conversation with Ann Comstock. And then it was, I think, Skype interview before we shifted to Zoom. And then my on-site visit, I realized, oh man, this church really could be my community and where I get to explore this season of mine in life. It took me more than 3 times to understand what God was calling me to. Maybe you're like me and it took a little bit longer, or maybe in each season of life, like it was for me, you needed to have somebody else remind you what the voice of God was sounding like. For Samuel and Eli, they needed each other. They needed to be able to learn from one another. And I can't help but acknowledge that my own journey in life, not just to the pastorate, but as a disciple, required others naming things in me, agitating things so that I could discern and process, and who called things and named things out. This journey of discipleship is not one that we are meant to do in isolation. It is one we do together. Sometimes we hear the voice of God on our own. I know for me, when I feel the Spirit moving within me, there is a heavy weightedness in my chest. It's like a fireball going off. And I know that something is stirring. I don't always know what or what it will be, but I know that the presence of God is moving within me. But without others, without all of you and this community, I wouldn't know what the voice of God sounded like in this season of life. My life has changed a good bit in the last year and a half, not just because of the pandemic, but because I'm now a mother of two. And prior to the pandemic, I was not a mother to a living child. So over this time, my own call to the gospel has shifted. And I'm reminded that even if I, who went to seminary and apparently was trained to understand God's voice and understand this journey of discipleship, and whatever other supposed to's come when you have the title Reverend or MDiv following your name, comes with that I still need help understanding what the voice of God sounds like. Because with each season, I change and I shift, and I sometimes assume it's always going to be the way it was. But unlike God, who was, is, and is to come, the most steadfast presence in our lives, our journey and call to the gospel isn't going to be the same. It's going to evolve and shift and meet us exactly where we're at. Because the gospel is always inviting. It is never stagnant. It is never complacent. And it never requires you to be anything other than where you're at. And if we're all called, which I believe we are, then we're all called to the gospel, which is good news. And if salvation means healing, then we're all called to the good news of healing. And our world needs a lot of healing, not just because we have systematic issues, but because all of us are still growing individuals and beings who live complex lives. And sometimes we don't have the time to heal. Sometimes things are going so fast, or maybe for you, you're acknowledging for the first time, like I am after being back from leave, is that the pandemic really changed my entire life. I'm not sure what rhythms work for me anymore. I really kind of liked the slow pace of pandemic life. I liked not having to schedule everything or count commute time in or wonder what's going to happen. And up until coming back from leave with my daughter, my second child, while parenting at home during a pandemic without help was really hard, I also never missed a single moment of my kid's life. And so I'm realizing that being back means I'm going to miss my kids' moments. I remember exactly where I was when I heard my husband say, "He walked." And I was in the office on staff gathering, and I was able to tell the staff, "Hey, my son just walked for the first time." It'll likely be, unless my daughter walks when I'm around, that someone who is helping us care for her tells me, "Hey, she took her first steps today." And I'm still learning what the pandemic did to my entire being. And so for me, I have to relearn or learn anew, maybe it's not a relearning, but a new learning, what God's voice sounds like in this season. And so I'm grateful that we get to do this in community, that I don't have to figure it out on my own, that I can name this from the pulpit and say, I'm still figuring it out. I don't really get what God is doing in this season of life, but I do know it involves healing. The pandemic was traumatic. Maybe you don't identify it that way, but for me, I sure do. Having to completely learn how to be different, how to do my job differently, how to connect with family differently. And during the pandemic, my father got very, very sick. And so we had to figure out, how do we care for him? How do we go and see him when we have a young child and we're not supposed to travel and we're not supposed to do things. There were so many not supposed to's that I didn't know what I was supposed to do. And so I'm reminded from my own life and journey that I don't have to have all the answers, that together we can piecemeal it, that we can acknowledge that, oh, maybe that's what God's stirring inside of you. Or, hey, you have this amazing gift for being able to go deep in conversation with somebody. Would you be interested in being a Stevens minister? Or maybe you're going, I really missed music. Maybe I'll give choir a try. Or you're thinking, man, I learned how to fix so many things around my apartment or house. I will join resource management because I now know how to find anything on YouTube and I can fix almost anything. The reality is we're all called and we're all gifted in many different ways. And the truth is that the gospel call never ends because we are continuing to develop as people. And there will always be a need for good news and healing. And I'm grateful that it doesn't always look the same, because I'm not the same. There's nothing about me that's the same that was even a year and a half ago. I've changed, and that's good. And the best part about it is that God meets me where I'm at. I don't have to go back to where I was for God to speak. As we see with Samuel and Eli, they needed each other because they had changed. They were trying to figure out what God was stirring within them and how to be faithful. I hope for all of us that when we figure out what that call is for this particular season of life, that we realize it is an abundant call, meeting you exactly where you're at, figuring out what gifts you may be able to offer this season, knowing that no matter what, God can use your gifts. And maybe you're not ready yet. Maybe you don't believe just yet that God calls all of us, and that's okay. And in that season, maybe it's somebody else naming it within you, identifying your gifts and skills for a time such as this. And I'm grateful that we get to do it together. Christ didn't even do it alone. And if he didn't have to do it alone, we sure as heck don't have to. He called disciples, and that's really what calling is about. A drawing to the gospel, a drawing to this good news, and then saying, let's figure it out together. This call is patient. Whether we're ready for it, whether we believe that we have skills for it, it's patient. It waits for us to respond with a yes. We see this repeatedly over and over in the journey of Christ. People would come to him and say, what is next? What should I do? And he gives them the next step. And sometimes they were ready and sometimes they weren't. But Christ never shamed or guilted anyone into this call. He simply said, this is what it is. Come as you are ready. And my prayer for all of us, wherever you find yourself this particular season of life, that you are able, when God calls you, to say, here I am, your servant is listening, and take that next faithful step. And if you're not ready, don't worry. God is patient, and God will wait until you are. And in the meantime, know that we are here to journey alongside you, that we are here to name and proclaim the gifts within you, and that no matter what, healing and good news lie before you. May we all find courage within ourselves this particular season to say, yes, Lord, your servant is listening. Thanks be to God that Samuel and Eli had each other, and thanks be to God that we have one another.